خیلی متشکرم آقای دکتر. آقای مایکل روس آمدن. من معرفی کنم سخنان بعدیمون رو. آقای دکتر مایکل روس، پروفسور مایکل روس، یکی از بزرگترین داروین شناسان و فیلسوفان تکامل جهان که با نهایت فروتنی و مهربانی دعوت ما رو پذیرفتن و مهمان ویژه روز داروین امروز هستند. Hello Michael, can you hear me?
Hello. Yes, can you see me?
No, not yet.
Now what am I not doing then? Hold on. Let's have a look. Oh, I see. Let's try that.
Okay.
Okay. Now can you see me?
Bravo, okay. So
yeah, I'm the good-looking one on the left. The ugly one on the right is the chap from Iran, okay?
Okay.
Okay. Now you'll forgive me. It's early in the morning, so I'm still eating my breakfast muffin, but I'm happy to go when you're ready.
Yeah, we are ready. We are ready. Just take ownership of the file and go.
Okay. Well, my name is Michael Roos, and I'm a philosopher and historian of science, and I work particularly on biology, and I work particularly on Darwinian biology, which means I work particularly on Charles Robert Darwin. Now, Darwin, whose birthday we are celebrating today, was the author of the very important work on the origin of species by means of natural selection. And in this book, Darwin argued that all organisms, including us humans, are descended from one or just a few forms through a natural process which he called natural selection. I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment or two. All the way up to and including humans. He doesn't talk very much about humans in the origin. He leaves that for a later work called The Descent of Man, which is published in 1871. But right at the end of the origin, he included a reference to humans to make it very clear he thought his theory applied to human beings. Now, it doesn't mean because something's interesting in the past, or it doesn't mean to say it's going to be considered important in the present. And there have been all sorts of ideas in the past which we don't accept anymore. However, as it happens, more than anything today, we accept Darwin's theory. And so what I'm talking to you about is not just of historical interest, but also of contemporary interest with respect to science, but also with respect to issues more generally. So let me start then my talk. I call it the origin of the origins. Okay, and so here we go. I've got about 10 slides I'm going to show you as we go along. I think I have to ask you to give me the next slide. Next slide, please. Or maybe I can do it this way. No? That's it. Thank you. Okay, so here's the basic facts about Charles Darwin then. He's born in 1809 on February the 12th. Interestingly, he's born on exactly the same day as Abraham Lincoln, the great president who saw during the Civil War, saw the end of slavery. Of course, Abraham Lincoln was born in America and Darwin was born in England. As it happens, Abraham Lincoln came from a relatively poor family, but Darwin came from a very, very rich family. I like to say it's like his father or his grandfather was Jack Bezos, because there was huge amounts of money. His grandfather was an industrialist and a potter, and he is famous for the famous Wedgwood pottery even today. Okay, so one thing is then that Darwin didn't have to work for a living. He worked very hard. He was very much respected as a biologist, but he never had to go out and, what should we say, be a university professor and teach students and talk to administrators. So he was born in 1809, and he went to university at the University of Cambridge with the intention of becoming a minister, a vicar, an Anglican priest. why would he do this? Well, because there was a lot of money and he was looking for a job where he wouldn't be too demanding and he could do a lot of natural history on the side. However, in 1831, just as he was graduating, he got the offer to go on HMS Beagle on a voyage around the world. And that was literally, for Darwin, life-changing. He came back and very quickly became an evolutionist, and I'll talk a bit more about why. He discovered his theory of natural selection in 1838, 2 years after he came back, but he did not, in fact, publish until 1859. I think the reason he didn't publish was because he knew his theory would be very unpleasant or unacceptable back then. And then finally, he published the Origin of Species in 1859. And then in 1871, he published his book on humans, The Descent of Man. And he lived another 10 years and died in 1882. So he would have been, what, 73. So he lived most of his life in the Victorian age. Queen Victoria came to the throne in 1837. So we refer to him as a Victorian, even though in many respects, his most important work, his creative work, was done before Victoria came to the throne. Next, please. Next slide, please. Now, this is Charles Darwin. This is a portrait painted about 1840 when he was 31. And in fact, it's a wedding portrait. He was just about to marry his first cousin, Emma Wedgwood. And so they both had their portraits painted. You might say, why didn't they have photographs taken? Well, because photography was only just then coming into being. And in fact, we have the first photo we have of Darwin is 1842, I think, a picture of him with his son. But it was customary to have these paintings done. The one thing I want to draw your attention to is that it's a very, very good painting. It's by a man called George Richmond, who was the leading portrait artist in England at that time. Now, I don't know about you, but I doubt many of you could say, oh, I'm getting married. I'd like my portrait painted by the leading portrait painter in Iran or America. Why not? Because you don't have the money to do it. Darwin came from a family which did have the money to do it. So, as I say, I like you to see this picture because it's not just the picture, but it's what it tells you, and it tells you something very important about Darwin. In other words, what I'm trying to say is that Darwin didn't come up with this theory out of nowhere. He came up with this theory out of things that were already in his society at the time. So Darwin didn't make it all up himself one day. What he did was, in England, we call it a kaleidoscope. You have all these pieces and you shake it up and then you look at it again and get a different picture. And that's very much what Darwin did. I'm not in any sense detracting from his genius, his creative genius. He did it, no one else did it. So I'm not denying that Darwin was a genius. What I am saying, though, is that Darwin didn't come out of nowhere. He came out of his Victorian, or as I say, pre-Victorian British heritage. Next, please. Next slide. So, as I said, in 1831, Darwin went on as a ship's naturalist on a voyage around the world, particularly around South America. The reason why the ship was going, it was a British warship, was they were mapping the coast because at this point, trade between England and South America was becoming very, very important. And they needed good maps so that ships going down there wouldn't crash on unknown shoals. So this British warship was mapping the coast of South America. And Darwin went, so for 5 years, they spent their time going round. Next, please. Next. When they finished in South America, they then set off home, but they didn't go back the way that they'd come. They set off and they went all around the world. They went to Australia, and then they went to South Africa, and then they went back up to England. And it was while they were leaving South America and crossing the Pacific Ocean to Australia, they stopped at a little group of islands, which are, oh, I don't know, 100 miles or something off the coast of South America. So they're much closer to South America than they are to China or Japan or Australia. And this is known as the Galapagos Archipelago. Now, I suspect most people, if you say to them, why do I believe in evolution, would say, well, because the fossil record shows it. You start with these blobs and then you get up to the dinosaurs, and then after the dinosaurs you get to the mammals, and then you get to the apes, and up at the top you get the humans. And so you look at the fossil record. It wasn't the fossil record at all that turned Darwin into an evolutionist. It was what we call geographical distribution, or a complex word would be biogeography. Darwin went to the Galapagos. He didn't discover this, but he noticed that on the Galapagos, the islands are, I've been there, they're 20 miles apart. If you're on one island, you could see other islands. I mean, they're really very, very close. But Darwin discovered, or he was told, that there are tortoises, giant tortoises, on the Galapagos. And you could tell, if you look at a tortoise, which island they come from. In other words, there are giant tortoises, but they are all different. And you can see, I'm showing you three. The one at the bottom belongs to the island on the left. The one at the top right-hand corner is the island on the right. And the one at the top left-hand corner is the island right up at the top of the picture. Different. It was the same with the birds. There are little mockingbirds, little finches. Similar, but different. Interestingly, they are also tortoises and birds on the South American continent, which are similar, but different. And when Darwin got back from the Beagle voyage, 1836, he sat down and started to look at the collections that he'd made, and he took a lot of bird skins and things like that. And he said, oh my goodness me, how did this happen? Surely it wasn't God so loved the Galapagos that he put different tortoises on the different islands. No, what happened was a tortoise or some tortoises came from the mainland and then arrived at the Galapagos and then slowly went from island to island. Notice, tortoises won't normally cross because tortoises don't swim. But if, for instance, a little tortoise was on driftwood or something like that, then it's quite possible that it might be blown from one island to the next. I suspect most of them would have drowned, but there would always be one or two who got over and who started to breed. And then what happened, as they bred, they became more and more different. And so Darwin said, my goodness, I believe in evolution. Next, please. And this is the first picture. It's in a private notebook. We still got it, 1837. And you see, Darwin drew this picture. Now, already, we're going to start seeing the point I made. Because if you look at this picture, you say it's a tree. But it's not just a tree. It's the tree of life. And Darwin always called it, and everybody else, the tree of life. Where do you get the tree of life? I'll tell you where you get the tree of life. You get it in Genesis, because it's in the Garden of Eden. The tree of life is in the Garden of Eden. So already we see right from the beginning, Darwin is using, well, let's call them Judeo-Christian metaphors, also Islamic metaphors, because Islam accepts the Old Testament. So in other words, Darwin right from the beginning is using religious metaphors from his culture. For Darwin, of course, these were Christian metaphors, but a Jew or a Muslim could equally accept this, the tree of life. So now, Darwin was an Englishman. I keep pressing this. Who was the most famous English scientist of all time? Isaac Newton, 200 years before, who was the man who finished the Copernican revolution, who said, yes, we've got the planets going round the sun rather than the sun going round the planets, and we've got the moon going round the Earth. When we shoot cannonballs out of a cannon, they don't go, ooh, loop the loop like this. Right, let me do it. There we are, loop the loop like this. There we go, there we are. No, they go in a parabola. And Newton came up with his force of gravitational attraction, which explained all of this. In other words, what Newton said is, give me this force, and then I can explain everything. And Darwin wanted to be the Newton of biology. Darwin wanted to say, I want to look for a force which will then explain the whole of biology. For instance, like those tortoises I just showed you in the last slide. So Darwin worked for 18 months to find a force that was equivalent to Newtonian gravitational attraction. So once again, Darwin is working within the context of his own culture, because he'd been at the University of Cambridge as an undergraduate. Isaac Newton was a professor at the University of Cambridge. So when Darwin went, Isaac Newton was one of the great figures of the past, the great glories of Cambridge. And so Darwin had grown up on Newton as a great scientist. So it was natural that when Darwin set out to find an explanation for this tree of life, he set out to be the Newton of biology. Next, please. Next. Well, now, very quickly, Darwin realized how you can change organisms. And the way you do it is through selecting the ones that you want and killing or eating the ones you don't want. Darwin came from rural England. In other words, Darwin came from Shropshire, which was the heart of agriculture in England. Agriculture was particularly important. Why? Because at the end of the 18th century, England particularly had had the Industrial Revolution. Suddenly, overnight, big cities grew up with factories, with machines, making cotton by machines, making metal things by machines, all of these. In fact, that was the reason why the Beagle went to South America, because the English looked cheap cotton, cheap metal things, and they wanted to sell them. And so they were selling them to South America, which was very rich because of all the minerals and the things that they grew down there. So they got money to pay for it. Now, if you have an industrial revolution with everybody living in the cities working, you've got to feed them, which means you've got to give them pigs and sheep and all of these things. But that means rural. But the point is, you don't have as many people working in the fields anymore. So you've got two things. You've got more people to feed, and you've got less people to do the agriculture, the farming. And so at the beginning of the 19th century, agriculture had its revolution just as big, as important as the Industrial Revolution. And the farmers had to find a way of making better animals more quickly. I mean, by better, I mean pigs, which are fatter, so you get more meat off them, and sheep, which are shaggier, so they have more fleece, so you can get more wool from them, and cows, which are better at milking, so you can get more milk and cheese from them. And the farmers discovered the way you do this, as I said, is by selecting. Look at this pig here. It's artificial. I mean, it's not a pig you find in nature. But why do you find a pig like this? Because what farmers did was, when they got a litter of piglets, they looked for the fat ones, and they said, yes, we'll breed from these, and the thin ones we'll kill now and eat now. And so they kept making fatter and fatter and fatter. So selection. So Darwin said, I want something in the real world, which is like agriculture selection in the farmyard. So, but agricultural selection is done by you and me actually picking out the pigs that we want. And of course, there's not you or me or even God picking out the animals that we want in nature. So Darwin was looking for a way to get a natural equivalent of artificial selection, and that would give him his Newtonian force, like gravity, to explain evolution. Next, please. Next. And in 1838, in September of 1838, and we know this because we've got all of Darwin's notebooks, Darwin read a book by an English clergyman, Thomas Robert Malthus. And Malthus was worried about the population explosion that was happening in England at that time, at the time of the Industrial Revolution. What was happening was that the population was growing and growing and growing very, very quickly. But Malthus said, the trouble is, the food supplies can't keep up with this. And so population grows at a geometric rate, 1, 2, 4, 16, geometric multiplying, whereas food production increases at an arithmetic rate, 1, 2, 3, 4. Geometric rate outstrips arithmetic rate, so you're going to get a struggle for existence, and only some are going to get through. And those some are going to be those that have characteristics like the fatter pigs. In other words, they are the ones that are naturally selected. And over time, this is going to lead to evolution and the tree of life. Next, please. Next. And so Darwin said, okay, I have now got an explanation of evolution. And what I'm showing you, they're now known as Darwin's finches. These are little birds from the Galapagos. Of course, they weren't called Darwin's finches when Darwin went there. And look at these birds. They are nice little birds, but they have very big beaks. Look at the beaks, they're big. Why? Because these birds eat cactus and nuts. There are other birds which have very fine beaks. They eat insects. And so Darwin said, natural selection is selecting for characteristics that will aid the organisms. They look as if they were designed. Again, Darwin's drawing on his background because he had read as an undergraduate at Cambridge the works by Archdeacon William Paley. And Paley said, look at the eye. The eye is something which didn't just happen. It looks as though it was designed. It was designed by God, the big designer in the sky. Darwin wasn't saying I don't believe in God. Darwin said, I don't want to bring God into the science. Very different. Darwin at this point certainly believed, Darwin at this point, I don't think he was a Christian, but he certainly believed in a creator God. But a creator God who was doing it at a distance, always through unbroken law, rather than through miracles, bam, 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 bam. No, laws, creation. And so natural selection makes organisms, but not just organisms which are adapted, which are design-like. Again, then, Darwin is drawing on his English heritage. Because why did Darwin think that organisms were design-like? Because the theologians, and Paley was an Anglican priest, just like Malthus, because the theologians were saying this design-like is the proof of the existence of God. So Darwin wasn't so much interested in the existence of God. He was interested in how do we get this? How do we get it through unbroken law rather than let's try it this way. Bam, 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 through miracles. And so in 1838, Darwin had got his theory of evolution through natural selection. Next, please. But as I said, Darwin didn't publish for 20 years. He didn't publish until 1859. Why did he take so long? Well, Darwin, as I said, although Darwin never worked for a living, he was already considered a good professional scientist. His time on the Beagle, for instance, he wrote letters home to the professors at Cambridge, the professors of science. He made these collections. And so when he came back in 1836, already Darwin was recognized as one of, let's call him one of the best postdoctoral students at the University of Cambridge. I mean, he didn't do a doctorate, but the equivalent of this sort of thing. So Darwin was very highly respected. He was writing on geology and all sorts of things publicly. He knew that evolution was not a popular idea amongst his professors. Apart from anything else, all of his professors at Cambridge were also Anglican clergymen. So, Darwin wasn't going to upset it. When I say they were, they didn't necessarily believe in 6,000 years of creation, but they certainly believed in a miraculous creation by God. Darwin had come up with this theory, which was going to throw it over. Now, think about this. You're a very successful young postdoctoral student. Your professors really like you. They think you're really good. I mean, if he wanted a job, they would have got him a job. He didn't need a job. So they really... Now, suppose you're in this situation and you come up with a theory, let's say, to show that Muhammad was a woman. Let's say something really ridiculous. Well, you've got all sorts of proof to show this, but I'll tell you something. You're not going to publish this publicly. Oh, no. You're a very successful student at Tehran U. You're really respected by everybody there. They're all saying, oh, this is one of our best students. Oh, my goodness. He published an article or a book which says that Muhammad was a woman. That's the end of his career. We don't want anything to do with him. And Darwin knew that if he published his ideas in 1830, but by 1859, all of the old professors were dead or almost dead. It didn't matter. People had moved on. So he was able to publish On the Origin of Species by means of natural selection in 1859, and that's what he did. Next, please. Next. And that led not only to evolution through natural selection, but to the recognition that Darwin was one of the great scientists of Britain, again, in context, but not just a great scientist of Britain, but a great scientist of England. And he was another Newton. So in other words, he was a great Englishman. And what do the English do when somebody in England is really important? They put their picture on the back of a banknote. And so the English £10 note has a picture of Charles Robert Darwin, 1809 to 1882. And I've told you, and that my time's up, exactly why Darwin deserved to be on the back of an English banknote. Thank you.